Good afternoon to all of you. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to the second conference of the cycle Un secolo di futuro, l'Università tra le generazioni, a century of future university through the generation, organized as part of the celebration of the centenary of the foundation of our university. Today's guest speaker is one of the most influential and internationally known economists. I thank Jeffrey Sachs for having accepted our invitation to reflect together on issues that are crucial for this time. I also wish to thank Massimo Bordignon, who will be taking part as a discussant in a talk that promises to be inspiring. The use of the expression ecologic transition and social inclusion is in the title of this lecture, not accidental. There are two phenomena that must be studied together. New development models must provide advantages for all. No one can be rejected or left behind. Reality shows that things don't always work in this way. We are all aware that the deep transformation taking place are increasing the inequalities between rich and poor, between those who have access to high level of education and those who don't have the chance to receive basic instruction, between those who are steadily employed and those who have temporary, ill-paid jobs. This divide is not a novel issue, but has significantly worsened in recent years. How can we change this course? One of the goals of this series of conferences is to provide some answer to these questions. We are positive that new political, economic, and social paradigms are necessary to understand the present. But what does the definition of a new paradigm mean in practical terms? What does it really mean and imply? In these talks, Jeffrey Sachs focuses on the notion of sustainable development that he regards as the new paradigm of a global development for the 21st century. This is a very interesting perspective because it aims at encouraging development, but without detracting from the importance of inclusivity. It is a primary characteristic of a fair society. We are therefore all very keen to listen to Professor Sachs' lecture, to gain more insight into his thoughts, and to receive suggestions for our work in the educational, cultural, and research fields. Thank you again for being here with us. And, of course, thank you all of you for your participation. Now, I give the floor to Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be together with you and to wish you a happy birthday, a happy 100th birthday, and a wonderful and crucial time to reflect on key questions for the world. And it's very suitable that we meet today because next week world leaders will be coming to Rome for the G20. Thanks God you have a wonderful prime minister, a classmate of mine, and one of the most capable politicians in the world, certainly. And this G20 meeting and the meeting that follows soon afterward, COP26 in Glasgow, are two of the most important and consequential diplomatic gatherings that we will have in our years. They had better be so important because we need a change of direction. And I want to describe a bit about the change that we need both in terms of the substance of economic life, but even more, since we're together at this great university, the ideas about economic life. Because we need a change not only in how our economies function, but how we understand economics itself, how we understand the aims, the ethics of economics, the ethics of political economy as governments undertake measures to steer the economy in one direction or another. I believe we need to be entering a new era. I hope that we will be teaching from very different textbooks in the future, with very different approaches to economics, with very different messages from the ones that we have in our core curriculum today. Because I think that neither the world economy nor the ideas about the world economy are right now. And we need a different orientation in actual economic life, but also in how we conceptualize economic life. It's perhaps not a bad idea to start 100 years ago, because there were ideas about economic life 100 years ago, mostly disastrously wrong, but they were ideas that were consequential, because just after the founding of this university, Mussolini came to power. The idea of fascism and fascist economics became widespread. Of course, the Great Depression ensued after 1929, and the Second World War came a decade after that. But ideas drove a lot of that change. The idea that economics was about struggle for survival, the idea that economics was the survival of the fittest nations, the idea that economics was it's us or them, the idea that economics is about Lebensraum, land room to the east, and therefore the need to depopulate or destroy neighboring countries, the idea that empire was the goal of economics. Well, this is what we lived through, and it was not, ideas mattered a lot. They were shockingly destructive and cruel. And we need to think about how ideas shape our lives and how they shape the economy today as well. We don't have quite the cruelty that we experienced between the 1920s and 1940s, but we do have a tremendous amount of cruelty in the world, and we have a tremendous amount of destructiveness of economic life in the world. What wasn't true 100 years ago is true now, and that is that our economic activity at the global scale is threatening our very survival because of its ecological catastrophic consequences, and yet how hard it is to shake free of this absolutely destructive course that we're on. We are today with 4 times the world population that we were in 1921 when the university started. The world population was just about 2 billion people, and it's just about 8 billion people today. And of course, there is vastly more average economic activity per person on the planet today than 100 years ago. So when we multiply the population by the increased throughput of material resources, energy use, land use per person, we can see how heavily we are weighing on the planet and how unwisely we are doing that. We're also a lot richer than we were 100 years ago, but we're not that much nicer than we were 100 years ago. Maybe that's not quite right, because the barbarity of 100 years ago was probably much more than today. But we are not a nice world economically, given what we could have in the world today. A recent report by the Food and Agriculture Organization, for example, the Rome-based institution, the institution that Italy hosts to fight global hunger, said last month that 3 billion people on the planet cannot afford a healthy diet. And this isn't headlines. This is a footnote one day in the papers, because basically we don't care. I don't mean we don't care, I mean the system doesn't react to that. It doesn't matter to say hundreds of millions of people lack basic access to health care. Hundreds of millions of children don't have a classroom to go to, and so will grow up without an education. It doesn't register in our system. It doesn't register in our geopolitics. It actually will not be solved next week by the G20, though I'm hoping it will be on the agenda of the G20. So our world is a world in which, compared to 100 years ago, there is vastly more wealth, vastly more income per person, less overall economic suffering, to be sure, but given our capacities to address human needs, a shocking neglect of human needs, of 1 to 3 billion people, depending on the kind of issue that we are talking about. 1 billion people in acute hunger, 1 billion people without the basic access to health care, 1 billion people whose children do not have a place in school, 3 billion people without healthy diets, 2 billion people without reliable electricity or energy services, and so on. So my theme today is that we need a different economic paradigm that not only does better for us to save the planet from our own worst behaviors, but actually alerts us each day to the problems that we should be solving, and tells our students from the first day, these are crises that need to be solved, not just background characteristics of an economy. And we don't have that, because if you look at the mainstream textbooks that we have today, you will find a box on climate change. You'll find a page on poverty. But these are side points to the discussion about the wonders of a market economy, the wonders and efficiency of the private market system. They are not the central challenge, the aim, the moral commitment that we should wake up to each day. Pope Francis, of course, more than any other person in the world, has been making this point in 2 beautiful encyclicals, Laudato Si, about saving creation, and Fratelli Tutti, which I would say in technical terms is about being nice to each other, about the encounter with the other, about the Good Samaritan, about taking care of others in need. And Pope Francis has called for a new economy of Francesco, of course, of St. Francis of Assisi, and very wisely, because he is our wisest moral guide, directed young people to come up with the new economy of Francesco. So us older types are looking on. We're trying to give a few references here and there to be helpful, but Pope Francis charged young people to rethink economics. And I want to talk a bit about what I think that rethinking can be. For me, the embracing concept should be sustainable development. This is a phrase that was brought into discourse in public policy back in 1987, when then Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Brundtland chaired a commission in advance of what would become known as the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And the idea of sustainable development that was stated by Dr. Brundtland's commission in 1987 was that the weight of human activity on the planet was so great that we were endangering future generations. So sustainable development was stated as each generation meeting its needs in a way that would enable future generations to meet their needs. It was stated as an intergenerational compact or an intergenerational ethic. It was the basis for diplomatic agreements that were reached at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 on three major treaties: on climate change in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the so-called UNFCCC, on the Convention on Biological Diversity, and on the UN Convention to combat desertification, or the spread of degraded land in dryland regions of the world. That was back in 1992. And it seemed for a moment that we had a new paradigm. It was even called Agenda 21 because it would be the paradigm of the 21st century. But we learned how deep the staying power is of the old paradigm, because we're 29 years later and we have not changed course. And not one of those three treaties has been properly implemented. In fact, the Biodiversity Treaty, till this day, has seen almost no result at all, except the continuing destruction of biodiversity on the planet. The Climate Change Treaty accomplished one thing, which was 23 years after signing, an agreement on what we should do to implement it, the Paris Climate Agreement, which was reached in December 2015. But till today, the underlying forcing that is creating the human-induced climate change, the emission of greenhouse gases, continues to rise every year. So we have not even changed direction, much less solved the problem. And the third treaty, I would bet, except if you're a specialist, you haven't even heard of. How many people here know about the UN Convention to Combat Desertification? It disappeared. It's completely unknown. I don't know if anyone in the United States knows about it. And I include the people in the senior reaches of the government, because I've never heard in my career any mention of that treaty by a US political personality or senior government official. And yet the dryland crisis, the water scarcity, the crisis of the interaction of water and climate change only intensifies. When the Paris Climate Agreement was finally reached 23 years after the Rio Earth Summit. It said we should stop destructive human-made climate change by keeping the rise of Earth's temperature to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. But today, ladies and gentlemen, we're already at 1.2 degrees Celsius, and the warming is proceeding at 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So do the arithmetic. On the current trajectory, we have 10 years before that threshold is breached. And just 2 days ago, President Biden was told, don't think about decarbonizing our energy system because 50 Republican senators and 1 corrupt Democratic senator said, we don't want to do that. Why? Because the oil industry pays them to say that. And they say that. And we almost regard it as normal. We even say we have a democracy. It's a democracy of money votes, not of people votes. That is our system, unfortunately, in the United States. When the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted, in the opening clause of the Paris Climate Agreement, it says, we, the governments of the world, agree to limit human-induced climate change within the context of sustainable development. So what did they mean by that in 2015? Partly they meant what Dr. Brundtland's commission said back in 1987, protect the future. But they meant something else that's referred to in the title of this talk, and that is social justice and social inclusion. Because the other phenomenon that has happened, in addition to the environmental destruction, is that our societies have become grotesquely unequal, and especially the United States, during the last 40 years. I would say unrecognizably so. We now have 3,000 people in the world, the billionaires, who have amongst themselves $15 trillion of wealth. 3,000 people. And if you think about that like I do as a professor at a university, if that were an endowment, $15 trillion of wealth would give annual spending of $750 billion a year, a 5% payout we use in the United States. So what could those 3,000 people and their wealth accomplish? With $750 billion, we could end all poverty on the planet, ensure that every child is in school, guarantee access to health care for every single person on the planet, ensure healthful food, access to safe water and sanitation, access to digital services, and access to renewable energy. That's what 3,000 people could do. Are they doing it? No. What are they doing? They're taking 15-minute space flights because they're seeing whether it's Mr. Branson or Mr. Bezos or whomever can get into space for 15 minutes and bring space tourists and so forth. 3,000 people could end the suffering. Sustainable development, as we use the term today in the global diplomatic context, means a world in which the prosperity is shared, in which there is social justice for all, or as the United Nations phrase puts it, in which no one is left behind. and in which environmental sustainability is respected, which in practical terms now means decarbonizing our energy systems, ending deforestation, reforesting and regenerating degraded lands, protecting biodiversity, protecting scarce freshwater resources, and living with nature so that we're not subjected to emerging diseases at an accelerating rate as we have suffered throughout this 21st century and as we face today with COVID-19, because we have an accelerating pace of zoonotic disease where spillovers from nature to humans are causing ever more devastating threats to humanity. The new economics, the economics of Francesco, in my view, should be the economics of sustainable development for the 21st century. Our economics should be based on goals. The goals are goals of well-being, social justice, environmental sustainability, and peaceful cooperation on the planet. Is that so hard? That's the puzzle I'm trying to understand. First, is it achievable? The answer, I believe, is yes, though I would encourage ample PhD dissertations to address that question. But as I understand the challenge, we can decarbonize the energy system. We could extend healthcare and education to every person on this planet at rather low cost, and digital technologies enable us to do that with the incredible efficacy now that wasn't available even a few years ago. We could produce healthful foods that we need in an environmentally sustainable way without destroying the great rainforests of the planet and without degrading the tens of millions and now hundreds of millions of hectares that we have destroyed in wanton misbehavior in the agricultural systems around the world. And I believe we could do it at very low cost, at a few percent of our annual output redirected for the human good, redirected for common purpose, redirected for our survival, after all. The puzzle for me is another one, and that is why we don't do it. What is it about not only the economic system that we have, but the economic ideas and the politics that we have that lead so relentlessly to this kind of destructive behavior? I've been trying to understand that question in recent years by looking at how the economy has been depicted and portrayed in ethical terms throughout history. And I believe that we hit a kind of cul-de-sac in the last 2 centuries in particular that have taken us away from the kind of ethical reasoning that we need. So let me explain for a few minutes how I have arrived at that conclusion. Probably the first writer about the economy that we could think about as giving us a modern sense of the economy is Aristotle. So I will put modern in the sense that we can recognize the economy that he's talking about, and we can recognize the political challenges that he's talking about. And Aristotle wrote the first book about this in the Politics, and I think it's still the best book that was written, actually. So that's not bad to be first and best. I think he holds the prize. Why? Because Aristotle said about the economy and politics 2,300 years ago that it should be oriented towards the good. So the idea of a polis, of the political community, of the civic life, was what the Greeks called eudaimonia, good spirits, or what we translate as a good life, a thriving life. And the politics and the ethics of Aristotle were about how to create that framework. It's not perfect, although he's my favorite philosopher. He didn't think hard enough about women, who he disparaged. He believed that there were natural slaves, and so this was not exactly the global justice that we would hope for. But it was the idea of politics and economy for the good and for the well-being of the members of the political community. The next body of thought about economic life is the scriptures. And these are partly simultaneous with ancient Greece and partly following the ancient Greeks. And I think that the fundamental complementarity of the scriptures is, of course, the notion of equality and the notion that as children of God, each person is accorded a basic dignity. And from the Hebrew Bible to the Christian Gospels, the notion was that there is a responsibility to the poor. In the Old Testament, of course, already in centuries before Aristotle, even the bondsmen and the slaves got the day off. Even every 7th year, they were freed of their bondage. There was a jubilee to have a fresh start every 50 years. The gleanings on the field were to be saved for the poor, and the stranger was to be treated as a member of the community because the Jews were strangers in a strange land in Egypt. And of course, Jesus taught that help for the poor was the highest blessing, the highest beatitude. It was the path to happiness, and poverty in spirit is the first of the beatitudes. And beatitudo is happiness. And so this concept, I think, is the great contribution of our religious heritage: the equality of people and the dignity of the poor, and the responsibility of the community to the poor. If you put these two together, the notion of a political society for well-being and attention to the needs of the poor, that's the makings of sustainable development. And so the puzzle is, where did that go? How did we lose that train of thought? And that is a profoundly important question in the history of economic ethics and economic thought. And I think that the best answer to that is we lost it in the change in the world that came in two periods. First, after the discoveries of the New World and the quest for conquest and the doctrines of discovery and the notion that one could get rich because society was no longer a static economy, but now one where there were riches to be had, our economic ethics turned to an ethics of accumulation, step by step. And we see this in many ways, but especially in the thinking of British philosophers. And I think the Anglo-Saxon turn was a decisive turn of economic thought. Because starting with, especially with Bacon, and then with Hobbes, and then through the British empiricist thinking, economic ethics turns to an ethics of accumulation. John Locke, in writing in 1690 in the second treatise on government, says that to accumulate is a natural right because it's merely mixing one's labor with nature, and since we own our own labor, we own the fruits of our labor. Locke was also not so much against taking the land of others, especially the Native Americans in the New World, as he sat on a board about the colonization of the Carolinas in the United States, because he said they weren't using the land properly. They were hunters and gatherers. We are farmers. We can mix our labor, make much more plentiful output, and that is morally correct. And actually, in the Lockean idea, the natural right of people was to the fruits of their labor, and the limited government for which Locke became so famous was limited precisely in the lack of legitimacy of government taking anything from the rich to give to the poor. Locke established the idea that you own your property, and government is to protect your property, not to help the poor, not to ensure community survival, not to ensure that the needs of the poor could be met. Indeed, Locke is actually quite shocking when you read him in American eyes, because he's our hero in our grade school and in our civic tradition. And I reached the age of 65 before I read Locke's thoughts about the poor laws. But his basic idea was that vagrant children from age 3 and up should be put in workhouses so that they wouldn't be a burden to the rest of society, but should be put to work. That is the philosophy, not exactly the mercy for the poor. Well, this new way of thinking had two more stages that I want to recall. One was the unexpected providential power of the market society, as told by Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote a brilliant book on the wealth of nations. It is filled with insight, but it's filled with a religious view that all will come out well in a market system. And so the idea of Smith is not only that a market economy is good, but it is providential. It is something like the natural order of the solar system or of Newtonian mechanics. And Smith recalls in his two great works that, or he argues in his two great works, that even great wealth ends up getting distributed to the poor so that the gap between the rich and the poor can never be too wide. It's a book of brilliance and a book of moral complacency at the same time. And that became deeply entrenched in the Anglo-Saxon philosophy that laissez-faire, leave the markets alone, not only honored the Lockean natural rights to one's labor, but also respected the providential guidance of the invisible hand of the marketplace. In 1859, of course, perhaps one of the most pivotal moments of intellectual thought in the history of humanity exploded on the scene with Darwin. And this, too, is an extraordinarily important part of the story of change of economic thought. Because Darwin, of course, made a fundamental breakthrough and insight that changed everything, with the idea that our complexity of nature and the evolution of humanity itself could be described as a natural process subject to natural law. It's an insight so counterintuitive, so powerful indeed, that in a way it's understandable that how late it came in human thought. Lucretius had a little bit of it, Epicurus had a little bit of it, but it took Darwin to put the pieces of the puzzle together. But in social thought, the consequences were rather devastating, because Darwin was crudely translated by those in power as arguing that power was not only morally right in the Lockean sense, not only providentially right in Smith's sense, but was actually a necessity for survival itself. And so Darwin unleashed social Darwinism, the set of doctrines that ended up evolving into the racialist and eugenics and Nazi doctrines decades later, that said life is not about well-being. As Aristotle said, life is not about love, as Jesus said. Life is about struggle, and the struggle is your survival or some other group's survival. And this, I think, was a final piece of destruction of an ethical grounding of economics. By the time we reached the 20th century, Britain was the dominant empire of the world. British empiricism was the dominant philosophical idea. And Britain's dominance meant that Smith's and Lockean sense that private property above all else should guide economic life became the core of economic teaching. And when I studied, we learned, of course, that if property rights are properly protected, all good will result in the world, aside from a few footnotes. There could be market failures of certain kinds, but those can be cleaned up. But we didn't hear about the profound moral failure of that approach. And much worse came the continental social Darwinists and eugenicists alongside the Nazi legacy, the racialism, and I come from one of the most racist societies of modern history, and all of this was fed by this pseudoscience as well. In short, ladies and gentlemen, economic thought became unhinged from our deeper traditions and our ancient wisdom. And I think that it is actually quite ironic. When I studied economics, we called classical economics Adam Smith. Because when we study in American universities, the beginning of intellectual thought is Adam Smith. Karl Marx was the one who named Adam Smith as the founder of classical economics. They never heard of classical Rome, of classical Athens, of classical thought, and of the body of philosophical thought of 2,000 years from 350 BC, when Aristotle wrote the Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics, to the beginning of the British Empire in the 18th century and Adam Smith's writing in 1776. That vanished from our tradition. We need to restore an economic ethics that starts with the notion that our communal life is for the good, and our communal life is about justice, and our communal life respects the equality of human beings. And that is the only way, I believe, that we're going to be able to bring about the practical changes as well that we need in order to redirect the use of resources on the planet. Living in the United States, as I have for the last 66 years, we are crazed with markets. It's almost impossible for an American politician, an American economist, financier, business person to even contemplate a world other than one driven by the profit motive, private property, and market forces. And the infringements on the market are still deemed to be offenses, almost offenses against nature, even as we destroy nature itself. I would say offenses against the natural law. And so the need for a philosophical revolution is deep. Where is it going to come from? Let me just conclude with the following. It will not come from the United States, believe me. The US will eventually catch up, but the mindset is so deep that we will not lead, and the US cannot lead this effort. The economy of Francesco will make a remarkable contribution, I have no doubt. Pope Francis's call for global interdependence is an equally important message for us, because the ethics that we need for the 21st century is not only sustainable development, it's not only great Western traditions that date back to the scriptures and to the ancient Greeks. It has to be a global ethic in a globally interconnected world. And that, I believe, is our even deeper challenge now. We need to find the language and the ideas and the basis for an economic ethics of sustainable development in which China, India, Africa, Latin America, indigenous populations can find their cultural roots, their ideas, their notions of the good in a common ethic for humanity. Because we cannot make sustainable development on our own. Any place. There's no single part of the world that can do this. This has to be a universal calling. I take great hope in one remarkable document of our time, and that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because in 1948, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II, in the aftermath of fascism and Nazism, in the aftermath of 2 world wars, in the despair of the human spirit, the governments of the new United Nations succeeded in putting together a document of a common humanity, a universal document. And the more one studies the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which starts in its very first article with the notion that all people are born free and in dignity, and therefore they have rights, and not only political and civil rights, but economic rights to decent lives, to education, to health care. When you study the process of the Universal Declaration, you see that it actually was the fruits of many cultures and many intellectuals that came together: Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhists, Christians, Jews, that put that document together. That is my greatest hope now, that we can use that basis, that experience, that wonderful document, which in 2023 will celebrate its 75th birthday, that in our generation we can say this is our starting point, and we want to update this. We want to complete it, because environment wasn't mentioned in 1948. The threat was not even known. But the common need of humanity for dignity, for decency, for rights and responsibility, I believe we can create together in the world. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let me start by thanking Professor Sachs, I think on behalf of all the audience, for this wonderful talk. It's really an honor for me to be here to discuss with him and to interact even with you. I mean, it was a strong call for a new way of thinking, and I'm going to ask him some questions about that. But let me first start by saying that I would also like to thank the Rector for inviting me to participate at this event, which is a very important one in a beautiful cycle of conference which are set up to celebrate an important date for our university, our centenary. And I think we should say that we are 100 years old, but it doesn't look like, okay? We are very young and fine. I mean, the talk by Professor Sachs was mostly based on this history of thought and the need to have a new ethical thinking for the future. But I would like to start even in stepping back, in a sense, to discuss this kind of step toward this new paradigm of sustainable development. And I would like to start with a quotation which I take from the last book, a brilliant book, by the way, by Professor Sachs, which is called The Age of Globalization, which I think that everybody should read. And this is a quotation from Edward Wilson. Actually, I think it's the only quotation that you make twice in the book. And Wilson is an evolutionary biologist. And what he said that humanity has reached the 21st century with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I think that there is no other sense that we could capture the problem better that we are facing today. Human civilization is extremely recent. We should not forget that agriculture was only invented 10,000 years ago, and writing less than 3,000 years ago. Biological evolution is much slower. For our brains and emotion, we are still wandering in a small group in the savannah. And according to anthropologists, if you believe them, what allowed the human species to make such incredible step forward is the specific ability of humans to inventing and believing collective myths. And this allowed for enhanced cooperation among individuals belonging to the same group with huge efficiency gain, but also justified the violence against other groups. With humans, even modern humans, for our brain, it's always the matter of us versus them, where us can be a tribe, can be the color of the skin, can be a football team, and now is a nation. Institutions are also very recent. I mean, we moved fast from tribes to empire, but democracy, the best way we have found to keep governments accountable and allow for peaceful transition of power, are just about 200 years old. And they are a small and declining subset of the world population. And actually, they are not even working that well, I mean, from the things that we were just discussing. So I think that one of the key problems that we legitimize global institutions who can take care of global problems. We do have the UN, and this is one of the questions I'm going to ask him before in terms of how we get to this new development. But UN has problem of representation, problem of governance, and also the ability to impose sanction. Technology is instead advancing at neck-breaking speed, and the use of fossil fuels allowed for an incredible step forward in human development in the last 2 centuries. But the same technology is now risking to destroy the environment that supports us. With what we heard, and we all know, global warming, deforestation, desertification, and loss in biological diversity. One thing which impressed me reading the book by Professor Phelps, but also has been, Sachs has been reminded in many things, that 1 million of species at risk of extinction in the next decade if we don't manage to do something about that. And in a sense, even the recent COVID pandemic is the result of this continued offense of human activity to nature. Now we have the digital revolution, which has increased already, will increase enormously the future of potentiality for communication, learning, and machine, but this also has increased inequality, and it risks to increase inequality even further in the future. The situation has improved, in terms of inequality and equality distribution across the world. So poverty has gone down. But inequality, so inequality across country, in a sense, has gone down. But inequality inside the country, in a developed country, has been increasing. And I think that this combination, the combination of Stone Age emotion, medieval institution, godlike technology, created the most serious obstacle to address the global problem of the 21st century. The us versus them syndrome makes it difficult to find agreement between conflicting nations, and our medieval institutions are not apt to global challenges. Technology might instead help, as it has perhaps the power to address its own deficiency. But because of the problem at hand, which the economists call them externality, right? We cannot certainly just rely on market forces to solve them. So technology needs to be guided with a combination of regulation and price signal, then again need to be provided by national government and world organization. And we are back to problem 1. So I think this is the situation, and Professor Sachs made a forceful point of the need to have a new way of thinking to get this kind of paradigm, but there are also some kind of obstacle in going there. I will not resist this time to ask him some question about even this kind of philosophical discussion that he made. But let me first ask some other thing which I think is in the mind of most people when we talk about this possibility of a movement toward more sustainable development. So I'm seeking just close to you because maybe we can organize ourselves better. Can you hear me? Okay, the first question is really, because you said at the beginning, I think we have the means now to make this step. So I will try to distinguish the two things in terms of what is the technological, say, feasibility and what is the political feasibility. So let me first start with the environmental problem. Now, if you look at the situation in Europe, for example, now, I think that most people is actually convinced that we have to do something about the climate. This is a change with respect to just a few years ago. A few years ago, it was more a matter for some the Greta Thunberg kind of people, green activists, and perhaps some enlightened people. Now a lot of people really think we have to do something, even because of the repeated evidence of extreme natural events, that we are now seeing it even at home, right? But what I'm afraid is that this consensus is quite thin, and it risks to disappear quite quickly. I mean, the sense that it very much depends on being able to define a transition path that does not impose excessive cost to people. If the transition is too costly and puts too many jobs and income in jeopardy, this consensus might quickly disappear. And there is also a distributional concern. The technology transformation is like to keep people. Just to make you an example of the thing which surprised me, we didn't have the time to go through some of the proposal, for example, the European Green Deal of the Fit for 55. Maybe we had time to discuss that. But basically, if there is a point about this program, is that we have to increase the price of carbon. We have to increase the price of energy produced by fossil fuels, right? Now, there has been just a spike in the price of gas, things which have nothing to do with the transition, the environmental transition. But the first thing that the European government did was immediately to rush to try to reduce this price. So, in a sense, doing something which is the opposite of what they promised to do in the next 10 years, which tell you how weak the thing is. And to be more specific about the question is, as you said already, we need decarbonization, okay? And we need to move to renewable energy source. For example, I look to the data, renewable energy source now cover about 20% of consumption in Europe. Cost of producing them is falling fast, fortunately, but are they falling quickly enough? Is technologically possible to substitute fossil fuel with renewable energy source in the short period of time that we have? And final question that I could not resist, what about nuclear energy? Okay? Are you in favor or against? I mean, if you look to Europe, for example, the country is doing better is France rather than other countries because they didn't give up their nuclear energy. So, please.
Great, thank you very, very much. Before getting to that, I'd actually like to dwell on Professor Wilson's very witty comment, but say a word about it. This idea that we have Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and, as he says, near godlike technologies, and so we can't make these harmonize with each other. This idea about Stone Age emotions is not a small matter, and I want to put it in the following sense. Why do we need ethics as a theory? What is the point about ethical reasoning? The point, as Aristotle said, and since he said it the best, I'm going to go back to him. He said ethical thinking is doing the right thing for yourself, but it's hard to do the right thing. And his point was, he wrote another great book called De Anima, or at least that's the Latin, the soul, and he talked about the fact that he didn't know where the mind was in biological terms, but he said we have three faculties of the soul. One is the vegetative faculty of nutrition and reproduction. The other, second, is the perceptive faculty where you have your senses and you go after food, for example, locomotion. That's the animalistic psyche. And then there is the rational soul, Aristotle said. And the rational soul is the one where we think what to do. And in Aristotle's thought, there was a battle that takes place in each of us, where you have the impulse of animal instincts, but then we have the reasoning to control those instincts. And of course, Plato said something similar with the charioteer on the 3 horses. And one horse was reason, one horse was passion, and the third was tume, which was will. And the idea of the charioteer was to make sure that the passionate horse was under the control of reason. Okay, now we have modern neuroscience. And modern neuroscience, in my view, broadly confirms Aristotle's idea. Because modern neuroscience says our brain is really a hodgepodge of evolution. So we have reason. It's mostly in the prefrontal cortex. We have instincts, which are mainly in subcortical regions, especially the dopamine-driven regions of the basal ganglia and other networks, and the amygdala, fear and emotion-driven regions. And so we're kind of messed up, you know? And what philosophy or ethics is about, in my view, is what Aristotle said, which was learning to think clearly so that we can discern the good thing to do. And that means controlling emotion by reason. And as Aristotle said, that takes practice, it takes mentorship, it takes habit. Because remember, ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, which means habit. So he had the idea that it's habit formation that gets us to behave in a rational way. Okay, I say all of this because I think this is our struggle, by the way. And it's not that we are only bad or only good. I'm not a big fan of St. Augustine, who said we are fallen souls and there's no hope in this life. The middle ground says, you know, we have some bad instincts, we have some good instincts, and we have to train ourselves to make sure that the good choices prevail over the bad choices. I regard as the Stone Age emotion issue. And to put it in practical terms, for example, we have a tendency, as you said, to have a mentality of us versus them. So we have a tendency of a fear reflex that says they're out to get me, I have to fight. But we also can reason that that's pretty destructive. So the reasoning is maybe we should talk with each other and try to reach an agreement rather than try to kill each other. And in game theory, we have the idea of the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma says that we should cooperate, but if you cooperate, I'm going to cheat and really trick you. And then in economics, we teach that the only equilibrium in that is that both cheat. Because any other circumstance, you're a sucker. Because if you cooperate, the other's going to cheat on you. And if the other cheats, you certainly don't want to be cooperative. And if he cooperates, the other person, you better cheat because then you can really benefit. So economists teach don't cooperate. That's not ethics, by the way. That's foolishness. So the reason I say this is that I'm watching right now in the United States. Every day we criticize China. They're our enemy. We have to arm. We have to make new alliances. We have to put NATO against China. This is Stone Age emotion of the worst kind. It's not moral reasoning. It's not ethical reasoning. Ethical reasoning would say, my God, we have a lot of potential gains for cooperation, but we have risks of cheating. So we had better figure out how we're going to work together with each other so that we don't blow each other up and we cooperate to save the planet. That's ethical thinking. American thinking is not that. American thinking is they are the enemy, we have to take action, otherwise you're a sucker. And by the way, America's trying to talk Italy into that position, and NATO into that position, and Europe into that position. My advice to you, don't fall for it. It's a huge mistake. It's Anglo-Saxon thinking. It's wrong. But it is about the Stone Age emotions. So the reason why our emotions are so interesting is we are capable of good outcomes, but they're by no means guaranteed. And ethics should be practical self-help to help us understand, don't mess up. We don't have to fight with each other. We need to cooperate. And if you read Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis's recent encyclical, it's like an ethics book. But not an ethics book of do this, do that. Pope Francis is a pastoral leader, so he's giving advice. He's saying, here's how you talk to someone else. Sit down, learn from them, respect them. He's giving advice as a pastor, but that's ethics. And so I just want to emphasize the thing with our Stone Age emotions is even Stone Age human beings could cooperate with each other, but they also could kill each other. And what we need to do is train ourselves in ethics, not in a bunch of list of rules, but in the ability to cooperate and to choose for the good. And that's what ethics, in my mind, is really about. So that comes to the question of our collective decision-making. That's where it's so hard. Because maybe if it's two of us, we can figure out how to cooperate. But how does a society figure out how to cooperate? You need a moral imagination. What could our society look like? Oh my God, we could do that? That'd be nice. And then you need to inspire people. This is what the world could look like. We could have a world without poverty. And think of all the benefits that would be, that would have. And so that's where the collective decision-making comes in. And there's an old, nice quip. I don't remember which politician said it, but I should remember, but I don't. But the politician said, we know what to do. We just don't know how to do what we should do and win the next election. Juncker. Was that Juncker? Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, that was Juncker, exactly. That's exactly right. So Juncker said, we know what to do. But if we do it, we won't win the next election. That's an ethics problem about society. Because our society should be such that we jump up when the politician does what should be done and say thank you for doing it. But we're not properly educated, ethically or substantively, to know that that's the good thing to do. And in the United States today, by the way, the people most under attack are the public health officials. They're getting threatened with their lives because American culture is so crude right now, so distorted, so ugly, that if someone says, wear a mask, you tell me to wear a mask, we're going to find out where you live and threaten you. This is literally happening every day in the United States right now. And that's an ethics. That's a breakdown of ethics in the society. So to come to the question about renewable energy, just before coming here, I was on a video conference with the head of Iberdrola, which is, it's one of the biggest utilities in the world. And the CEO of Iberdrola is a wonderful man named Ignacio Galan. And I knew Ignacio 15 years ago when he just started as CEO, and he told me, we're going to bet on renewable energy. And what was interesting, by the way, in this talk, because I was doing an interview with him, they're making a fortune on clean energy because we need it. And they have the technology, and they had the foresight, and they've been doing it for 15 years. So the company's growing tremendously. It's building wind, it's building solar, it's building grids, it's building pumped hydro storage, batteries. Wonderful, by the way. A wonderful success. The market value has gone up, I think he said, 6 times since he started as CEO. The bottom line of this was proof of concept that all of these things are feasible at a mass scale, actually. So I left that conversation about 2 hours ago feeling much better, because his advice was, don't listen to those politicians, we're really doing it. And that's usually good advice, by the way. But it's not quite true, because without the politicians, we're not going to do what needs to be done, actually. We need politics as well as good companies doing these things. But technologically, we can do this, but it requires, I kept asking him, what is required? He said, stability of the regulatory environment, because these are 20-year investments or 40-year investments. So it can't be the government does this, then the government does that, then the government does this. And we need consistency. This is a big problem for our governments because they are short-term thinking. They're, I'll speak for my government, not very competent, sometimes absolutely malevolent, like the idiot that we had as president before this very nice president that we have. I won't even say the name of the other one. But we need a different kind of politics. And it's not markets, by the way, it's plans. We need a plan for how to convert the energy system. Markets can do certain parts, like Iberdrola, but Iberdrola can only do it if there is a government plan for decarbonization. So we need both markets and government. And then we need a public that is properly educated enough to say, absolutely yes, that's who I'm voting for, is the politician that promises the safe way forward. And that comes back to us. And it's probably a good idea to remember another point of Aristotle and of Plato, but especially of Aristotle. They puzzled, how do you make a good society, after all? And they said a good society depends on having virtuous citizens, because virtuous citizens will produce a virtuous government. And then what should a virtuous government do? It should produce virtuous citizens. Well, how do you get started on this? That they didn't figure out. And so the question is, how do we make sure that we have the proper virtues as citizens, and then as virtuous citizens that we're demanding virtuous government? That, I think, is the real essential issue.
Thank you very much. Let me pick up some of the things that you said, because you anticipate some of the things I wanted to ask. But then the first thing, maybe, I know quite well China, because I've been traveling in China quite a lot. I don't even need a visa any longer to go to China. They were so fed up of seeing me coming and going that they decided to give me a permanent visa. Yes. But, that's, frankly, having lived there and talked with people there, that's quite a nasty regime. We cannot, so here there is a clear, difficult problem. So in a sense, what I wanted to ask you, maybe you can answer after, how do we deal with China? Because we are really talking, the US might have, of course, his own responsibility, but you need two to tango, right? So, and here, I think that there is some kind of problem. So, for example, in your book, you seem to have quite a positive view about this Belt and Road Initiative, which instead I'm a bit less positive. So maybe we can discuss about that. Certainly, you cannot make step forward on environment, whatever, without involving China, but it's a difficult partner to sit with. I mean, they do have their Stone Age emotion. But I wanted to go back a moment to this kind of political feasibility. And then, at the end, I'm going to ask you some questions about philosophy. I mean, I'm just postponing, but this is, I think, is important. In a sense, you mentioned already, I mean, this kind of a need of cooperation. We could not be, I could not agree with you more. But fighting global warming is, is something like you mentioned already, akin to providing a public good, a global public good. And, with public good, there is always the risk of someone free-riding behavior. So, I mean, how do we avoid this, in your view, in this kind of building, this kind of, you need a multilateral agreement across all this government to have this plan go in that direction. How we keep the things, the people alone, how we keep country alone. Let me use just an example. I mean, I'm going to mention whom you didn't want to mention before. I mean, all countries signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, but then Trump come along and say, well, you know what, I'm going to step to leave the things. And what the other country could do, I mean, and all the other countries will say, we regret it. But once that you have regretted, I mean, if Trump was there, the US would have been out of the Paris Agreement. And at least one positive thing that you can say about the US and Trump, that, Trump at least had a public opinion against him. I mean, you could have Jeffrey Sachs criticizing him. If it was Xi Jinping to leave, he wouldn't even have a public opinion inside to fight in that direction. So, I think this issue of keeping things together, is the crucial issue in this framework, in this movement forward.
I think the issue about China and the world is really an important and fascinating issue. And I don't think China knows about its own future, and I don't think we know about China's future or our future relations. My view of China is the following. First, it's a great civilization. It's one of the foundational civilizations of humanity. China has had probably the most remarkable statecraft on average of any place in the world over the last 2,000 years, while Europe was ripping itself apart in war almost nonstop. China had long, long periods of peace. That's a great political success. China's philosophical base is very different from the Western base. Obviously, it's not a Christian base, nor is it the Greek polis. In China, probably the foundational ideas are Confucianism, and Confucianism is heavily about the virtue of harmony and order. And harmony and order in an administrative state has been the dominant philosophical position of China for 2 millennia. Of course, oversimplifying, but if one found a common thread, it is that there is an emperor who requires the mandate of heaven, and the role of the emperor is to make harmony in the society and peace. And when Confucianism was predominant, like in the Song dynasty, the idea was that there were rights and responsibilities throughout society. More hierarchical, but responsibilities. And the idea that is shared with Aristotelianism is the idea of virtue. So there is responsibility. And Confucianism says train the virtues in the same way that Aristotle does. I view this as extremely important, not an incidental footnote of history, but as the meeting of two great philosophical traditions. And why can't there be two great philosophical traditions in the world? And why can't they be mutually interactive and responsive with each other? So when President Xi talks about common prosperity or the harmonious society, I don't regard that as propaganda or as simply words. I regard that as a Chinese philosophical position with a different set of ideas. And China has not had the electoral democratic traditions ever. But China also talks a lot about democracy, and not in a cynical way, but rather about participation in deliberation and discussion. And just last week, Xi Jinping talked about deepening the democratic participation through people's councils around the country. Of course, our press immediately said, well, this is propaganda in blah, blah, blah. But it's not propaganda. It's a different culture and a different society. And what's wonderful about a different culture and a different society is that we should talk to each other and learn from each other and discuss the future and discuss the different concepts of the good and discuss the difference, which I want to do very much, of Aristotle and Confucius. What do they mean? What are the different roots of our visions about what a good society is? Of course, in our ignorance, we dismiss everything about China as, well, that's the Communist Party dictatorship, and then we add in that wants to take over the world. Another hint to you, if there's any country that wants to run the world, it's mine, not China. The United States is completely convinced that it should run the world. It's actually literally in all our foreign policy documents. The need for the U.S. to be the unchallenged military power and foreign policy leader. What an idea. What hubris. But it actually comes, by the way, from a Protestant evangelical fervor that has been there for hundreds of years, that said that it started with Britain, they had the idea first, that this was part of providentialism, that the English should run the world. Well, it didn't work out quite that way, but America took up the idea because it's the same philosophical, same cultural roots. So actually, China doesn't want to run the world. It never did in the last 2,000 years really want to be more than the Middle Kingdom. So it didn't launch many wars. China hasn't fought in a foreign war for more than 40 years. It fought in Vietnam in 1978 because of very local conditions. How many wars has the United States fought in since then? Every year. In Central America, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and not to mention blowing up Indochina. We're good at war. By the way, it's all for democracy and human rights, you understand. So I'm much more for dialogue, first of all, because I want to know what's on the minds of Chinese leaders and intellectuals, because I'm sure it would be profoundly interesting. Second, I'm impressed with a lot of what China does, I have to tell you. So the United States, I don't even know the number now, but we've had more than 650,000 deaths. We've had more than 700,000 deaths from COVID. Excuse me. More than 700,000. China, 5,000. because they controlled the pandemic. If you think that's propaganda, I'll tell you it's not propaganda. I'm leading a COVID commission for The Lancet. I'm deeply engaged in the data, the fact situation. China really controlled this pandemic. Do we ever give China credit and say, how did you do that? I haven't seen that in one day in the pandemic. To actually ask, how'd they do that? When I say it in the United States, I'm considered nearly a traitor. Of course, by people who know nothing. But they don't want to know about what China did. They know what China did. It must be evil because China did it. Or that's what you can do in an authoritarian system. There's no curiosity at all. But I can tell you China did some remarkable things, like when there were outbreaks in Beijing or in other places, they tested 11 million people in a weekend in a city. Can you think about the social capacity to do that? We could never do that. But that's not bad also. That's actually, at times, you need that social capacity. So I want to know, how did you do that? But we're not interested in asking that question. So that's another matter. President Xi announced, because Europe did it, Europe pushed, so all kudos to Europe. When the European Green Deal was adopted, President Xi responded that China will decarbonize by 2060. That's not good enough, by the way. It should be 2050. And China can do it by 2050. But it's also not bad that they said by 2060. And if you think it's just words, I can tell you, because it is China, as soon as he said that, my colleagues in universities all over China intensified their work on decarbonization pathways. It wasn't just words. They were given a mandate, basically. They heard the words of the president, and so study groups started all over the country. More detailed reports, more intensive, ambitious scenarios. So we would do good to speak with China about these things. And that is my bottom line, which is that good ethics is, like Pope Francis told us, talk to the other, encounter the other. Don't assume the worst of the other. Don't think that the other is only out to trick you, deceit. Maybe they want cooperation also. And it's a little weird to me in this interconnected world where we could get on Zoom without any moment of loss that President Biden and Prime Minister Draghi and President Xi aren't having weekly chats. How's it going? Because that way we might end up also not blowing each other up in this world, because we would understand the perspectives of the other side.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to clarify, I mean, I have a lot of respect, of course, for China, and a lot of respect for their culture, and a number of people in China are very good friends. It's just that they have this ability of command and control that we don't have any longer. It would have been very difficult for us to have. So, I mean, I remember that they managed to reduce pollution in Beijing by 25% in 1 year. But of course, they had to use some kind of drastic means to reach that thing. So, you know, there is the balance is a bit in this direction. But so since you have talking about the US, you are talking about China, let me talk about the European Union instead. What you think? The European Union, I mean, is now trying to do with this 455, also the European Green Deal, whatever, big step forward. You know? But of course, if it's the only Europe who does that, this is not going to, I mean the Fit for 55 would help the environment in another way, but if you took a look at the global warming, of course, the European Union is already, we are producing, I think, 8% of total gas. So there will not be a solution, it will be a cost for consumer and company, but in a sense, going back to what you were saying, learning, helping the other to see what we are doing, maybe that would be a way in which the European Union, lead. I mean, the European Union has not hard power. We don't have an army, not even a foreign policy, but maybe we have, this kind of soft power. Maybe if we move, people will follow. What do you think about it?
Europe has the highest quality of life on the planet, period. Europe is the region with the greatest orientation to sustainable development. Europe actually puts together political democracy, social welfare, and a commitment to environmental sustainability, objectively speaking, more than any other place in the world, by far. I do an annual ranking for the UN of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And all of the top, I think it's the top 17 or 18 countries, are all European countries.
Where are we? Italy?
I'd have to look. I don't remember. And also, I do an annual ranking of happiness, something not quite eudaimonia, but an annual survey that the Gallup company does in 160 countries in the world, asking people about their life satisfaction. All of the top countries are European countries. By the way, Italy's not in the top, but it's rising fast because the crisis was quite bad, and Italy was in the ranked 40th or 45th, and now this year it jumped to 28th. So I keep counting on Italy to reach number one, all right? Objectively speaking, you should be the happiest. Why? Because you live in the most beautiful country. And look, where we are, and every place you look. And I was just saying to Sonia, my wife, just walking in Milan today, how beautiful. So you should be happier. 28th is not right yet. It'll go up. But my point is, Europe is actually doing a good job, very good job. And having 27 is not easy. My advice is, not surprisingly, a little more Europe, a little less national, to strengthen the European institutions, because Europe needs a bigger budget at the European level, not only at the national level. And it needs to be able to take system-wide decisions more effectively. One of the reasons why COVID was so hard to control in Europe was that effectively the pandemic was controlled at the country level or even local level in some places rather than at the European-wide level, and yet everybody moves. So it was constantly being reintroduced every day across national borders, and there was no effective cooperation at the European Union level other than finally getting the vaccine coverage up. But the public health coverage was all at the national and local level, and that didn't work effectively. So there was a lot of lost opportunity for control. But broadly speaking, Europe is on the right track. Europe should cooperate with China. It already has spurred China's commitment, which would not have happened otherwise. The United States is trying to say to the European Union and to NATO, come with us. Remember, you're on our side. They're the other guys. We're against them. And the head of Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said a couple of days ago, the new NATO plan will be to confront China. This is terrible, ridiculous. NATO doesn't need a new assignment.
What we need is actually a cooperative approach. So this is where I would say European soft power, as you put it, could play a very constructive role. There is one big challenge that I think Europe is not effectively addressing, and it's a huge one for Europe, as you know. It's a huge, huge challenge, and that is Africa's development situation. Because, you know, something interesting, by the way, in 1950, Europe had twice the population of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East combined. Now Europe, even broadly with Russia counted and so forth, has half the population of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. And by 2050, it'll probably be a fourth of the population of Africa and the Middle East. And that, unless Africa is developing properly, that really will be more and more crisis for Europe. And yet there are, just as the things we're talking about, there's so much that could be done. And the main thing that should be done, incidentally, is Europe and the African Union should team up to ensure that every young person in Africa gets a good education. Because this is the most important single thing to put Africa on a development path that is self-sustaining and that is also mutually beneficial for Europe. And that is the best conceivable investment that could be made, but it's not happening. So this, I think, is the one place where instead of only focusing on protecting the borders, how are we going to do this, keeping the terrorists at bay in the Sahel and so forth, education as the main commitment would be transformative. And it is a natural vocation for Europe together with the African Union. And it's the one piece of the policy puzzle that I see missing right now that I think is a big deal for Europe.
Thank you very much. On this, I agree very much. This is another of the problem of Europe, of course, that is still not a full federation. So it's very hard to make decisions when you have unanimity rule, 27 countries, and whatever. So that's part of the problem. What we feel in Italy in terms of the kind of trouble that we had, even for the increase of population in Africa, is not held in other countries. This makes problems. Anyhow, we are getting close to the close, and I suppose to, at least to allow for some questions from the floor. But since I have kept this question until now, let me pose it, because I'm sure that my colleague here are asking themselves, why don't you tell him? Which is that in your description of history of economic thought, and you put a lot of blame on the philosopher, the Anglo-Saxon philosopher, for the new way in which we look at economics and the kind of disaster, some kind of exploitation. Economics just as a sort of the task of the economy, just as a sort of exploitation. But two things which are worth, probably signaling. First, of course, we had a lot of exploitation even before that. I mean, it was not the history of humanity, is not the result of a few Anglo-Saxon thinkers which say that economics should have been done in one way or the other day. And the other thing which is, quoting another philosopher of the economy didn't quote, which is Karl Marx. That would have been said that this kind of way of thinking, it was an ideology which served the scope of a growing bourgeoisie at the time. So now perhaps what we need is really a different kind of ideology, maybe going back to the classic in the sense of Aristotle and Plato. Anyhow, that was only the comment that I wanted to make. And anyhow, this maybe, probably I think you agree on that. I mean, it had also some good thing. I mean, the market and the function of the market, some kind of this kind of incentive, I think allowed the economy to grow. Don't you agree? I mean, the last 2 centuries, I mean, not everything was bad.
The idea of Adam Smith, the idea of Bacon and the scientific revolution was that we could have improvements in life and accumulate wealth. And it's actually not a bad idea. And indeed, coming out of poverty, more wealth was a very good thing. But it is not sufficient for it's not sufficient for the kind of world that we have today. And so, as always in ethics also, and this is an obvious point in thinking about the ethical history or the history of ethics, each age requires a rethinking of what is the good. And one can certainly, maybe forgive is not quite the word, but one can, and both unfair but also not exactly right, one can understand and appreciate Smith's idea of the wealth of nations as being a worthy idea at a time when the world was in poverty, and wealth was a way to escape from the suffering of poverty. As I said, it led to a certain kind of complacency, a certain kind of naivete. It was divorced from clear ideas about the good. But in any event, now we have a world of wealth. We can thank Adam Smith in part for that, although I would thank the inventors even more than the economists for that, because it was the application of scientific knowledge and technology that has made it possible to have the kind of wealth that we have in the world. But the point now clearly is that being guided by wealth as the main purpose is an anachronism, and an extremely dangerous anachronism. And that is perhaps maybe the most charitable way to put it. In getting out of poverty, it's not bad to think about wealth. When one is already wealthy and creating so much destruction and so much despair, and when there's so much unattended suffering, thinking only about wealth is a malediction. It is not a solution. And when we run a society based on the idea that we must get richer and richer when we're already rich to the point of self-destruction, it becomes an urgency to rethink. And I think that that really is the point, that in the 21st century, we have to recognize that we're in a different world and a different era from Adam Smith. And yet, in a strange way, the field of economics, as I learned it, which admittedly is a half a century ago, but as I have taught it also, and as it is still taught in our textbooks, is an anachronism. And that's really the main message that I am proposing today, which is it's urgently time to think about the different approach and not to be held back by the strictures and the principles and the supposedly classic texts, which are not the classic texts, but are important texts of their day. But now, in a new day, we have to draw upon both our more ancient traditions and our more urgent and pressing challenges.
Okay, I could not agree more. Okay, we are very, very close, but I think we can collect a few questions from the floor. So let's have maybe we can collect 2 or 3 questions, and then...
Maybe 1 or 2, because we're really
you are running. Sorry.
Patience.
Okay,
so.
Please. Yep.
Right. My Well, I have first an observation regarding your opinion about China first, because I don't see what's happening in Hong Kong fitting your idea of open to discussion attitude of China. And the other question is regarding the new paradigm you're describing to us. You're saying that the change has to start from the people, people who has to make up their mind and then choose the politicians which will make the change. By how can you actually drive people and unify their will without using ideologies?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the role of ideology in your paradigm? That's the proper question.
On China, we are not trying to have dialogue and discussion. In fact, in the US government position, the position is to end the so-called strategic dialogue that took place 10 years ago. The notion being that we're past the time of talking. China's dangerous and we need to respond. We need to create new alliances. We need to strengthen the Quad countries, which are India, Australia, Korea, and Japan. We need AUKUS, this awful Australia, US, UK new alliance. In other words, the mindset is we're beyond talking. Talk is useless. They'll just trick us. No use in having a dialogue. That's literally the position of the United States government. This is never right, but it is certainly not right today. And remember, the last 4 years by Trump was so unstable, so unilateral, so mad, because he's nuts, that from China's point of view, all they saw was trade barrier this, sanctions this, elimination, kill Huawei, arrest the CFO of Huawei, anything went. And so we haven't had dialogue for many, many years. And it's not like we've tried. It may seem to some like we've tried, but we're not trying. I know, we're just not trying. And I know senior people in the administration whose basic order is, no, you can't have a dialogue right now. We're not doing it that way. That's the mistake. And I think by enriching the interactions, we would really find there's a different approach from the one that we're on. We're really going to make the enemy that we are fearing, we'll make it a reality, because this can be a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. I was making a somewhat different point about the public and the politicians, saying that it is a paradox, unsolved. If you need virtuous government to make a virtuous citizenry, and you need a virtuous citizenry to make a virtuous government, how do you do this? That's a mystery. By the way, Plato didn't solve it, and Aristotle didn't solve it. They talked about how you can stay in the lane once you have it, but they didn't solve the problem of how to get to it. That was the purpose of the Republic, Plato's Republic. And I was absolutely delighted to learn a fact about Plato. We visited Syracuse this summer, actually another beautiful part of your country, and I was so happy to learn that Plato had come as an economic and political advisor 3 times to Syracuse, and he failed all 3 times. And it made me feel great, because most of life as an observer, as an economic advisor, is failure. You go, you say things, and you're perfectly well ignored. Or the politician does exactly the opposite. And I felt so good. If it happened to Plato, my God, it can happen to us too. So the truth is, no one has figured this out exactly. There are periods of good government, there are periods of bad government. It is our job to help push towards the good government. My second favorite painting in the world after the School of Athens at the Vatican is Lorenzetti in the City Hall of Siena. The good government, the allegory of the good government and the allegory of the bad government, because there you are in Siena and you see them both. So I didn't want to imply that there's an easy answer to this. Virtuous leaders can do a great deal. Good leadership can make a huge difference. And a public that expects virtuous leadership can make a big difference as well. And I come from a country that elected Donald Trump. That is shocking, really depressing. I don't want to end on a depressing note, because we defeated Donald Trump in 2020, but just barely. So something is not right in the body politic, and that is a serious problem that we're facing now.
We went very close to elect someone who is not very different from Donald Trump, so I mean, you are not alone. I would have liked to, I think it would be very nice to go on forever, but unfortunately we have really to stop. So I would like to thank a lot Jeffrey Sachs for his talk. And I'm inviting the rector